All right, here comes some folks now. Welcome,
right.
welcome everybody.
Yep. Hey everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. Yep. Sorry.
No, you're okay. Sorry, myself.
We're talking over each other already.
Yeah. Welcome everybody. As we we're going to take, a minute or two to let folks trickle in here at the top of the hour. But thank you all for joining us today for our webinar all about cultivating the entrepreneurial mindset in ourselves, our communities, and beyond. So my name is Nick Hool. I am the Director of Client Engagement at the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. I'm going to rename myself now. And I'll be the MC for today's event, if you will. Gary's going to kick things off here in a bit with content. But as we're going through, we're going to have a couple stages to break for Q&A. So make sure you're thinking of questions, and you can drop those in the chat anytime you feel like it. And I'll read those out for the audience to hear if you send them there. So the chat or the Q&A function, both along the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see those, and we'll be able to read those out for you as we go along. Couple housekeeping things. We're going to try to keep this to an hour as best we can with those breaks for Q&A. So if we need to go over a little bit with Q&A, that's okay. For those of you who can stay, that's fine. We'll be recording all of this, as you probably heard when you joined, and we'll send that recording out within 24 hours, along with the slides and some other helpful links that we mentioned. Also, I'll be dropping links to references of papers and books and things of that nature that Gary brings up throughout the presentation. So without further ado, it looks like we've kind of hit a good stopping point of new folks joining. If everyone, just to get the conversation started in the chat, wouldn't mind putting your name, where you're calling in from, and what brought you here today. Are you excited to learn about becoming more entrepreneurial yourself, instilling it in others, or anything else that you're interested in hearing about? Thanks, Dan,
Hey, Dan.
from Mesa,
yeah, welcome,
Arizona.
Dan.
Welcome.
Yep.
Hi, Joe from PA.
Okay, want to use it with incarcerated population? That's awesome, Joe. Happy to help with that. John
Yes.
Danner, I teach entrepreneurship. Awesome. Kate Wiggins joining from Durham. All right, we got a lot of cool things happening in North Carolina with Ice House. Kate, I'm not sure if you're familiar with NC Idea, but we've got a pretty big initiative happening there. Rhonda, VP Strategy Innovation at Rung for Women at St. Louis Nonprofit. Want to go through facilitator training in July? Great. Welcome, Rhonda.
Hey, Rhonda.
Kate, I am. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Oh, great. Emmanuel.
It's Ogunjemulua. Did I pronounce that right? Sorry. Ogunjemulua. Emmanuel. From Nigeria, Department of Entrepreneurship. Welcome all the way from Nigeria. That's awesome. So happy to have you here. And yes. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Hi, Kirsten from Denver. Teaching entrepreneurship in high school. That's awesome.
Yeah, very exciting. Okay, well, with that, Gary, you want to take it away?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you, Nick. And thanks everyone for joining us. This is a monthly webinar we do, which just kind of gives you a brief overview of our work, some insight into the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. And more importantly, I don't think if I'm being honest, I would love it if you use our program. Don't get me wrong. But I want this webinar to have value to you, whether or not you decide to use our program materials to support your entrepreneurship programs. The basic ideas, and I think about this every day, pretty much all day. We need to get this right. Like, entrepreneurship is so important, and yet the subject of entrepreneurship is fraught with so many myths and misperceptions, and that we need to get this right. Still, folks chiming in here. Deborah, welcome. Hello from Puerto Rico. Awesome. Dr. Eileen Figuero Rivera, welcome. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to share with you some of what I've learned in the last 30 years. I hate to say that, but in my interest in entrepreneurship. So Here we are, cultivating entrepreneurial mindsets in classrooms, organizations, and communities. To begin, my name is Gary Schoeniger. I'm the founder of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. This is a company I started in 2007. We are now the world's leading provider of entrepreneurial mindset education, training, professional and organizational development. And we are also the creators of the Ice House Entrepreneurship Programs. And I am the co-author of the book, Who Owns the Ice House, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. So some big questions that I would like to address in the next little while. And I'd like this to be conversational. So please keep dropping your questions, comments, suggestions, whatever in the chat so we can pause and have some dialogue. And my co-pilot here, Nick, will sort of help facilitate that dialogue. But the big questions I want to take a look at here are, what is an entrepreneurial mindset? Let's get at that. Why is it important? And how can I develop it in myself and others? Now, one of the important things I want to talk about here is, how to teach entrepreneurship if you're not an experienced entrepreneur. That's really one of the foundational concepts of Ice House. You do not need to be an experienced entrepreneur. You don't need to be a subject matter expert in order to teach this class. And that's because we're facilitating discovery. We're not instructing someone on how to do something specifically. So an important point I wanted to just start out with. So let's begin with this basic idea that the world has changed in ways that now require all of us to think like entrepreneurs. I'm emphasizing the word think because I don't mean to say that means we all need to start a business. And one of the important points I want to make here is that we need to stop thinking about entrepreneurship in a binary way. Either you're an entrepreneur and you're going to start your own business and be your own boss and create your own destiny, or you're going to be an employee and you're going to, work in an established organization and you're going to abide by rules and processes and procedures. We need to stop thinking that way. The word entrepreneur arose 250 years ago at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, when we needed a word to make a distinction between the person who operated and organized the business and the people who worked in the business. And I'll argue that that distinction is going away, that entrepreneurial attitudes and skills are the skills that employers now demand. Perhaps another way to think about this is that the mindset that once enabled us to succeed is rapidly becoming obsolete. And maybe as a rhetorical question, you can drop your answers in the chat, but ask yourself, what is a non-entrepreneurial mindset? People ask me frequently, Gary, what exactly is an entrepreneurial mindset? And sometimes the best way to answer that question is with another question. What is a non-entrepreneurial mindset? So when we look at entrepreneurs, and I've been studying entrepreneurs as an anthropologist would study culture. And I think there's an important distinction to be made here, an important point to be made, that mindset is to an individual what culture is to a group. And so I think that's a very useful framework for understanding the entrepreneurial mindset. When we look at entrepreneurs, and by the way, I'm not really interested in the mindset and the machinations of Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. I'm interested in the everyday, what I would call the unlikely entrepreneurs, the people who have no particular advantage over others, yet somehow they manage to not only identify opportunities, but evaluate them and bring them to life in spite of the fact that they don't have access to resources, Stanford MBAs or rich relatives and so forth, right? How do they do that? When we look at what I would call the typical entrepreneur, the everyday unlikely entrepreneurs, what we see are people who are highly resilient and resourceful. They know how to identify and solve problems amidst resource-constrained, highly ambiguous circumstances when the path is not clear and the rules for survival are not yet known. And you know, those who have an entrepreneurial mindset are essentially future-proof. There's unlimited demand for people who can think like entrepreneurs. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, but in 2008, I was hired by the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute to do two things: to do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education ecosystem in North America, and then to fill in the gaps that we found. And one of the things that stood out very, very quickly is that the way that entrepreneurship is typically portrayed in the classroom doesn't really map to the reality of what a typical entrepreneur is actually doing. And when we started looking deeper at the data, and others have looked at this as well, the typical entrepreneur, even entrepreneurs who start large established companies like Waste Management, Hewlett Packard, and Walmart, they initially start out pursuing small niche opportunities. They don't have much experience. They don't have much money. They're not spending much time writing business plans or doing market research. And so that was the first big aha in this Cisco project, that the way it's being portrayed in the classroom doesn't match the reality. The other thing we saw that was missing is, people were talking about all the managerial aspects of entrepreneurship. And they seemed to conflate entrepreneurial attitudes and skills with managerial. There was no distinction there. And lastly, what we also saw is they're not really getting at the mindset. What is the underlying logic that drives the behavior? And what we found is that a lot of people sort of default to trait-based assumptions about entrepreneurs, that the entrepreneur is somehow born with what one economist referred to as scientifically unfathomable abilities. And the rest of us are just relegated to a life as an employee or a traditional employee. And in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. And that is what psychologists call a fundamental attribution error. We're overemphasizing the importance of traits, and we're ignoring the situational factors that influence their behavior. So Cisco gave me the platform to go around, so I came back to Cisco and I said, well, no one's really talking about the mindset. They're not really getting at the logic. They're talking about these mechanical things, but they're not getting to the deeper why. And that's sort of where I sort of took this anthropological, ethnographic approach. And so thankfully, Cisco gave me the platform to go across the United States and interview several hundred everyday entrepreneurs. And I heard so many interesting stories. What I was looking for are the common and replicable factors in their logic, in their beliefs, in their behavior. I was looking for the common and controllable factors. If someone said, well, my dad gave me a bunch of money, or I inherited the business, or whatever, I'm not really interested in that story. I want to know how people who have no particular advantage over others manage to do this. In that research, I stumbled across Clifton Talbert, who became my co-author, my good friend and mentor. And all I knew about him when I met him was that he was one of the founders of the Stairmaster exercise machine. And when I asked him how he learned how to think like an entrepreneur, like what influenced him and to put him on this path, he explained to me that he was born in a very poor cotton community in the mid-1940s. He was born to a teenage mother, didn't know a father, And he said, for people that look like me, the work was in the cotton fields. And he explained that that's what he was doing until he was about 13 years old. And that's when his uncle Cleve, who owned the local ice house, invited him to work alongside him as his helper. And what Clifton said to me was like, in the Mississippi Delta in the 1940s, 1950s, when you're a 13-year-old boy, you're just about a man. And so he went to work with his uncle Cleve, and his uncle Cleve taught him how to think like an entrepreneur. Now, what I recognized immediately is that the basic concepts that he was learning from his uncle were the same concepts I kept hearing over and over and over again in these stories. And I began to realize there is this underlying logic. It seems to transcend time, socioeconomics, culture, gender. There's a fundamental human aspect to this that's common. I started to see that the entrepreneurial spirit is the human spirit. And so shortly thereafter, I went to the Kauffman Foundation, where we were, the Kauffman Foundation gave us an initial investment, and we developed a curriculum and using Clifton's story as the inspiration. The 8 life lessons from an unlikely entrepreneur are essentially 8 core concepts that we distilled from hundreds and hundreds of interviews I've now done across the world from entrepreneurs all over the world. And so that's the basic backstory. Now I'm going to tell you, here's how the Ice House methodology works at a 10,000 foot level. There's 5 basic ideas here. Start by redefining the term entrepreneurship in a way that everyone can embrace. The term means so many different things to so many different people. It can be intimidating. When we think about it as a business-only discipline, we immediately eliminate more than half the population, because not everyone wants to start a business, but we're all intrinsically motivated to discover opportunities. And so we'll talk more about that in a minute. The second idea is introduce the learner to these 8 core, what I'll call entrepreneurial competencies. In the book, we call them the entrepreneurial life lessons, whatever. These 8 core, these common and controllable factors that are situation independent, they're IQ independent, they're resource independent. You can embrace these ideas regardless of whether you're working for minimum wage or you want to change the world. Doesn't really matter. We then immerse the learner in the opportunity discovery process, in the entrepreneurial process is another way of saying that. Immerse them in the process. The only way you can develop an entrepreneurial mindset is to immerse yourself in the process. The mindset is an effect rather than the cause of the behavior. That's a very important point. Expose the learner to relatable social models. So, unless you're teaching at Stanford, stop talking about Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. In order to get people to adopt this behavior, they have to see people that they can relate to succeeding in this domain. So what we've done in the Ice House program is we've embedded little short video vignettes from some of the interviews that I did so that the students can learn or have the core concepts reinforced from people that come from similar or worse circumstances. And lastly, we want to encourage personal reflection. What we want the learner to understand is that your mindset is a belief system. And it's a belief system that is perfectly designed to create the outcomes that it creates. And that's really, a big part of this is helping the learner recognize that it's our deeply held, mostly unconscious beliefs and assumptions that create the outcomes in our lives. I'll talk about each of these. Let's start with redefining entrepreneurship, right? So one of the biggest challenges we have is the way in which we define entrepreneurship. And so many people hear the word, they think of the Silicon Valley high growth venture backed type entrepreneurs. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. But statistically, the venture backed high growth entrepreneur represents less than a single % of all entrepreneurs in the United States, probably less than that abroad. And so this narrative around, this what I'll call the Silicon Valley narrative tends to skew our thinking not only about how to be entrepreneurial, but who can be entrepreneurial. So we're trying to get away from that and expose people and look beneath the surface, look more deeply at what a typical entrepreneur is actually doing. It's really quite compelling. Some folks think of an entrepreneur as a business owner, and they teach small business management skills, and they tend to ignore the entrepreneurial skills. And one of the findings that came from our research is that the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to discover an opportunity are almost entirely distinct from the attitudes and skills required to exploit that opportunity. Very important point also. So when we zoom out, when we look from, say, 30,000 feet, we define entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunity to create value for others. And by creating value for others, we empower ourselves. Now, that took me 25 years to sort of think about this, to land on this definition. But the important point here is that anyone can embrace this definition. And ironically, what happens when we're able to pursue our interests and develop our abilities in an autonomous way and in a way that benefits other humans, we tend to become optimally engaged. And so the more useful we become, the better off we're likely to be. And so maybe another mindset question, I'm just asking questions that are intended to get at our deeply held beliefs of which we may not be aware. And one of those questions might be, what is preventing you from making yourself more useful to more humans, right? Because I think, Adam Smith wrote this in The Wealth of Nations. We all live by exchanging useful things with each other, right? That's what we would call first principles. We all live by exchanging useful things. But we don't really dig any deeper to think about what is the useful thing that I'm exchanging, and with whom do I exchange it? And how can I make myself more useful to more people? We just don't think about that because we're operating on assumptions of which we may not be aware. That's the mindset piece. Okay, enough about that. Introduce 8 core entrepreneurial competencies. I'm going to rip through these very quickly. There's in the Ice House materials and the facilitator training, there's a much deeper dive into each of these. Before I do that, let me say this. So what I've done is I've interviewed, probably more than 500 entrepreneurs over the last 15 years, looking for these common and controllable factors. At the same time, I'm looking at the literature and the research in anthropology, behavioral psychology, cognitive psychology, sociology, to explain what I can only describe as a behavioral phenomenon. Okay, so here's what it looks like. When we interview an entrepreneur, you can try this yourself, right? Very early in the conversation, they're going to start talking about some sort of a compelling vision. They're choosing something on the horizon. They're striving to achieve something. They have a compelling goal. They're choosing their future rather than allowing circumstances to control their fate, right? What was that? Maybe you can help me out here, Nick, that quote from Jung about I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. I think that's more or less accurate. A quote from Jung. And I see this as the foundation, right? It's the compelling goal that elicits the behavior, right? And so, another rhetorical question, do you have a compelling goal? To be compelled means to be irresistibly pulled towards something. And if you don't, you should maybe ask yourself, why not? Like, do you have something you wake up thinking about, something you're striving to achieve? Or, do you wake up and go to work and think of it as drudgery and look forward to weekends and holidays? Big difference, makes a big, big difference. It's not obvious on the surface. Second thing we notice in entrepreneurs is they tend to see problems as opportunities. They intuitively, and this is not conscious for the vast majority, they see problems as opportunities. They inherently understand that by solving problems for others, I can empower myself. The more useful I become, the better off I'm going to be. Now, that's very different from a more traditional mindset, right? Where we as a result of formal education and managerial systems, we very often come to assume, without realizing we're assuming it, that someone else is going to tell me what I need to learn and do in order to be successful. So there's an important distinction there. They look at problems as potential opportunities. They also tend to be action-oriented, and to the uninitiated, this looks like reckless abandon. But when we look deeper, what they're actually doing is micro-experimenting. They're trying lots of little things. They're making lots of small bets. And this creates what I call an error-based feedback loop that enables them to tease out opportunities that cannot be seen with traditional business planning or financial forecasting. It's really a superpower. It's called micro-experimentation and opportunistic adaptation. Another idea that emerged from this research was that, the entrepreneurs, very often they're not straight A students, but they are avid learners. But they're not learning typically in traditional means. They're learning in non-traditional, what's the word I want? It's not non-traditional. It's informal and non-formal means. And informal learning is like outside of a formal curriculum with maybe a tennis lesson or a swimming lesson or something like that. And the other is learning that occurs without effort or awareness. We're just learning through our experiments. There's knowledge we're acquiring tacitly, implicitly through experience. We notice that entrepreneurs are resourceful. They don't spend their time chasing investment or bank loans. They tend to start where they are in their spare time, using whatever discretionary resources they have to try their ideas on a small scale. And by doing so, they become resourceful. They understand the difference between spending their discretionary time and effort and resources and investing them. They become reliable. And I cannot overemphasize this. It goes back to the lesson 2. It goes back to the power of choice. There's this relentless focus on the customer, on user experience. And by doing that, they can take an ordinary idea and turn it into something significant. I happened to be watching a lecture from Warren Buffett the other day, and he said something to the effect of, I've never seen a business, and he said, I've seen a lot of businesses, but I've never seen a business that delights the customer and doesn't succeed. The point being, you don't necessarily have to have a great idea. It's the focus on the other that enables them to succeed. We also notice that entrepreneurs tend to immerse themselves in a community of practice, and they teach each other. They create support networks, and imagine what happens if you surround yourself with other people who are striving to achieve things, who are figuring things out and making things happen. If you look at the work, for example, of Nicholas Christakis in his study of the network effect and the power and influence of not only your friends, but your friends' friends and your friends' friends' friends. It's just unbelievable the way that the people we surround ourselves with influence our lives. And lastly, what we see is this very high degree of resilience, the ability to continuously get back up after getting knocked down. And so many entrepreneurs have told me in not so many words that what it all came down to is a refusal to quit. So that's a quick overview of these 8 core concepts that we've distilled from this ethnographic interviews that we've done. That's the sort of the core of the Ice House method. We then immerse the students in the opportunity discovery process, and we do that using what we call the Ice House Opportunity Discovery Canvas. It's a derivative of Alexander Osterwalder's business model canvas, yet I've tried to take out the business vernacular and frame it in a way that anyone can comprehend. When we look at the process that entrepreneurs undertake, what we call the opportunity discovery process is broken down into 3 basic phases. And the first phase is essentially the problem finding phase. And so many people get this wrong. They just start with a solution and then they set out looking for a problem. So this requires empathy, it's exploration and inquiry and observation. It's understanding the problem from the perspective of people who have the problem. And there are some sample questions. There's more questions in the facilitated materials, but essentially, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Who has the problem? How are they currently solving it? You got to get out of the building and talk to and interact with the people whose problems you're trying to solve. Here's a really important point. Opportunities abound. It's not that they're hard to find, it's that they're easy to overlook. And the opportunities are, they're unmet, unarticulated needs that are latent. It's not like people are walking around asking for their problems to be solved. They don't know what they want and need, and they'll tell you one thing and they'll do another. So it requires this detective-like discovery methodology. Begins with problem finding. Then we move to problem solving. That's where we start. Once we understand the problem, then we start tinkering with a minimally viable solution. We design and conduct experiments to test our ideas with the people whose problems we're trying to solve. Once we have evidence of usefulness, then we try to replicate that and we execute on that. We try to replicate it and we communicate the value of what we're doing to a broader audience. Here's the funny thing. You know, there's 2 schools of thought. The entrepreneur as the careful planner, the MBA. That doesn't match with reality. The other school of thought is the reckless, screw it, let's do it with entrepreneur. That doesn't match the reality either. What we find is they're acting like discoverers. They're acting like scientists or detectives. And ironically, they're following the scientific method. They're doing the background research. They're creating a hypothesis and conducting experiments. And then once they have evidence of usefulness, they then begin to replicate their findings, and then they start to communicate the value to others. That's essentially, in a nutshell, the discovery process. So we use the canvas to guide this process. The students assemble in small teams, get out of the building, start interviewing people, maybe in chunks of 5 people, start to talk to the people whose problems you're trying to solve, discuss it with them, learn to ask good questions, listen, observe. Don't try to sell your idea. This is about diagnosing. It's not about prescribing in the beginning. Listen and observe, note the observations, and then modify the assumptions. So then use the canvas to come back into the classroom to show you can teach each other what you're learning. Here's what we thought. We went out and we talked to all these people, and here's what we learned, and here's how we're modifying our experiment accordingly. Okay, number 4, this is really part of our secret sauce, the exposure to relatable social models. So in the Ice House program, there are approximately 14 different case studies, we'll call them. There's a wide representation of everyday, unlikely entrepreneurs that students are learning from. You know, Dawn Haffiker is a disabled veteran who became an entrepreneur by accident, told me, like many others have, I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. The guy on the right here is Brian Schoeniger. He created a company called 1-800-GOT-JUNK with $1,000 as an 18-year-old high school senior. There's all manner of case studies. So the learner can learn from people who have come from similar or worse circumstances, right? Okay, last point. We're encouraging the person to engage in personal reflection, right? We all have a mindset, yet very few of us are aware of it, much less the ways in which it influences our behavior. It took me a long time to find a precise definition of mindset. And it wasn't until I began to study culture and the work of Edgar Schein that I was able to see the correlation that culture is to a group what mindset is to an individual. So I took Schein's definition of culture and I modified it slightly. So I'm defining mindset as a pattern of values, beliefs, and assumptions learned by an individual that's worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore assumed to be the correct way to perceive, think, and feel. Super important definition. And by the way, I'm going to send you guys this recording and the slides afterwards. So don't worry about it if you don't have that memorized. There's 2 important aspects of a mindset I want you to understand. One is that our mindset is this mechanism that basically determines the output we get from whatever inherent capabilities we happen to have. Warren Buffett said it like this. You got a guy over here with a 400 horsepower engine, but he only knows how to get 100 horsepower out of it. We all know people like that. And then you got a guy over here with a 200 horsepower engine, but he knows how to get all 200 horsepower out of the engine. That guy's better off than the guy with the 400 horsepower engine. That's where the mindset is so important. It really, this is how underdogs win. This is the essence of the David and Goliath story. But the second aspect of a mindset is this. Regardless of our inherent capabilities, regardless of whatever horsepower we happen to have, our mindset also becomes a fixed way of thinking that prevents us from adapting in times of change. In fact, the more expertise we have in a particular domain, the more we are likely to struggle in times of change. So here's how it works. On the surface, this is level 1. This is where we see the visible artifacts and observable behavior. Level 2 is what we know and what we say that we value, our explicit knowledge and our espoused values. But level 3 is our deeply held values and taken for granted assumptions of which we are largely unaware. That's where our mindset resides. And as I said earlier, our mindset is largely responsible for the outcomes in our lives. Yet because we're not aware of that connection, we often struggle in the face of change. When we look at a mindset from a clinical perspective, we think about perceived locus of control. Do I have an internal locus of control where I have a deeply held, mostly unconscious belief that I'm in charge of my own destiny? Or do I have an external locus of control, which is a deeply held, mostly unconscious assumption that fate, luck, circumstances, powerful others somehow control my destiny, right? point to be making here is that we don't walk around saying, hi, my name's Gary. I have an external locus of control, but it shows up in my language. It shows up in my behavior, right? That's an example. Are we intrinsically or extrinsically motivated? Are we purpose-driven or are we profit-driven? Are we doing things just for the money or the letter grade? Are we doing it because it's interesting and rewarding? The literature shows that people who are intrinsically motivated outperform people who are extrinsically motivated by carrots and sticks. Again, it's the David and Goliath story. That's one of the secrets of the entrepreneur. There's a passion component, there's a purpose component to what they're doing, which gives them an enormous advantage over people who are just going to work to collect a paycheck. We look at the fixed growth orientation, and this is informed by the work of Dr. Carol Dweck at Stanford, right? Do you have this underlying belief that my talent, my intelligence, my abilities are fixed? Or do I believe that they can be developed? We're not aware of these deeply held assumptions, yet they have an enormous impact on the goals that we set for ourselves. Optimism versus pessimism, right? People who have a pessimistic explanatory style. Oh, this always happens to me. Versus someone who has an optimistic explanatory style. I got to find a way. I got to find a solution. Enormous difference. And lastly, I think the big kahuna here is perceived self-advocacy. This comes from the research done primarily by Albert Bandura at Stanford in his research in self-advocacy. And Nick, if you'll be kind enough to post a link to that paper, that brief paper, 3 or 4 pages, it's eye-opening. What he's basically saying is if you have high self-efficacy, that's basically the beliefs about your own capabilities, here's how you'll benefit. You'll set high goals for yourself. You'll stick to those goals in the face of adversity and setbacks. You'll experience psychological well-being and social integration. You'll benefit in all these ways. If you have low self-efficacy beliefs, here's how you're going to suffer. You're going to set low goals for yourself. You're going to give up easily on those goals. You're going to be vulnerable to depression and anxiety and all, you're going to suffer. And the good news is, our Ice House programs are designed to help shift a person from lower to higher self-efficacy beliefs through a process we call guided mastery. The core underlying assumption of an entrepreneur is that it's up to me to figure out how to make myself useful to others. And by doing so, I can empower myself. 99 times out of 100, this is a tacit assumption of which the entrepreneur is largely unaware. But what's happening is that, they're stumbling into this trifecta of human motivation. And what we often fail to recognize is that the desire to fulfill human needs is a powerful innate desire. And it's not just in some of us, it's in all of us. That is the desire to fulfill human needs through our own efforts, not by doing something someone else told us to do. Very important. It creates a very powerful incentive to learn. That's really the point. So what you have is the individual is here and they're striving for this compelling goal. They're striving for something and they believe they can get there because it's being reinforced by these relatable social models. And we're showing them the process, roughly speaking, of how they do it. And it's important to recognize that, when the challenge greatly exceeds our skill, we become anxious and it's difficult to function. When our skill exceeds the challenge, we become bored and disengaged. What we see in entrepreneurs is that they're optimally engaged. And if you don't hear anything from me today, hear this. That's what this is really all about. It's not about business. It's about optimal engagement. That's what the entrepreneurial mindset education is all about. So, as a result of the entrepreneurial process, what we see in experienced entrepreneurs is an internal locus of control, a deeply held belief that I'm the captain of my own ship. I'm in control of my own life. They tend to be intrinsically motivated, right? The task itself is the reward. You don't need to coerce them with carrots and sticks. There's a growth orientation. They learn that they can learn anything they need to learn in order to get where they need to go. They tend to become optimistic, and it's the goal itself acting on them. And as a result, they experience a higher degree of self-efficacy. So just to wrap up this final point here, that entrepreneurial skills are 21st century skills. These are the skills employers demand. These are the skills the world now demands, right? This, back to my point, there's no distinction between, or we're rapidly losing the distinction between someone who organizes the business and someone who works in the business. You know, it's interesting to me. I use Uber a lot when I travel. I'm always asking the Uber driver, do you have a business card? And almost always they say no. And it strikes me that maybe they're sort of still stuck in this employee way of thinking, that the electronic app is going to tell them what to do. But they're not thinking about what else do these people need. It's a really simple idea. So I'm going to pause here for a minute and ask some questions. Nick, do you have anything in the chat? I see that there's some activity in the chat. Not sure what's going on there. And if not, I'm just going to wrap up with some final comments.
Yeah, a quick couple call outs. Joe Hartford, sorry, sent us a link to an interesting article that I wanted to draw everyone's attention to earlier. That's a nice article about 7 billionaire entrepreneurs who actually started either homeless or very, very poor. So that's a super interesting one. And John Danner had an interesting suggestion for an addition to our definition of entrepreneurship. So at the end of the definition, to add in any setting, just to help further emphasize that point of this isn't about starting a business. It's not about running an organization even necessarily.
Yeah, regardless of circumstance. I love that, John. Thank you.
Yeah. And then Joe says, what resources can you share to help me with the incarcerated population? That's a good question, Joe.
Yeah, that's Ice House. And we've done so much work. We've got so many people that are doing amazing things with formerly incarcerated populations, and we can share some of that stuff. And there's a case study done by Dr. Linda Keene at Ole Miss.
I'll post that in the chat now.
You post that in the chat. That's one place to start looking. She's done amazing things. I've worked with her. I've given talks inside maximum security prisons, and just seen amazing transformation with Ice House. How does lean startup differ from Ice House? Ice House different from lean startup. It's a great question, John. So lean startup has this sort of high-tech, venture-backed assumption baked into it. And, you know, this became very clear to me. I facilitated a startup weekend in Cyprus several years ago for the US State Department. And about 120 very bright young Cypriots came to this. Most of them had college degrees. And yet when they saw the business model canvas, they were kind of stumped. They didn't understand what a segment was or a market was, and it was too businessy. And so that's the general idea is more or less the same, John. It's just sort of breaking it down in a way that someone who might not want to start a business, or someone who's not, you know, in that venture-backed high growth domain or mindset. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Rhonda's asking, does the discovery process speak to identifying problems that are of value, therefore can be monetized, or is it just learning to identify problems in general?
Great question, Rhonda. So, you know, what we're encouraging the learner to do is search for evidence of usefulness. In most cases, a paying customer is evidence of usefulness. And that's the most common form of evidence of usefulness, but it's not the only form. And we encourage this in the training and in the materials, Rhonda, that evidence of usefulness might be buy-in from your colleagues or your boss. It might be users or subscribers or followers or readers. It doesn't really matter. The point is that opportunity discovery is an evidence-based process. It's not based on statistical data. It's not based on opinions. It's not based on whether or not you won a pitch competition. It's an evidence-based process. That's really the key. And I'm grateful that you asked that question to give me an opportunity to kind of zero in on that point.
Yeah, that's great. Well, looking at time, Gary, how about we
Yep. Did I just stop sharing? I did not mean to do that. Okay. Can you see my screen, Nick?
Nope, you did. You stopped sharing.
All right. Let me fix that.
All right.
Whoops. Hit the wrong button. Sorry. Now you good?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about where we've been with the Ice House program. The Ice House has gone and taken off in ways that we could never have imagined when we launched it in 2011. Peter Drucker once said, when a new venture does succeed, more often than not, it succeeds in a way that the founder never anticipated. The product's being used by people it never anticipated in ways that the founders never anticipated. That's true more often than not. It was certainly true for the Ice House program. Since we launched in 2011, the program's been recognized at the United Nations. It's been recognized at the Vatican. I was invited to present to the European Commission in Brussels. Kaufman published this thing saying the Ice House program is redefining entrepreneurship in classrooms and communities worldwide. There are 4 different versions of the Ice House program. There's the original edition. There's a student success edition now that's meant for, like, say, high school juniors, seniors, incoming college freshmen, as a way to help them succeed in college and in life by embracing an entrepreneurial mindset. There's a small business edition, which is developed specifically for small business development efforts. Most recently, after a very successful pilot funded by United Way at Erie, Pennsylvania, with several thousand students, we coordinated with their teachers that participated, and we created a middle school edition of the program that's been very, very successful as well. We've trained about 3,100 facilitators on 5 continents over the last 10 years. It's just blown my mind at the ways in which we've trained facilitators in Siberia. It's just Australia, South Africa, Argentina, all over the world. It's just insane how educators have embraced this, and not just traditional educators, community development folks, economic development, small business development, nonprofit organizations. I'm using educator in the broadest sense possible. Community colleges are using our Ice House Entrepreneurship Program as a way to increase student persistence. We did a blind study at Pikes Peak Community College on 1,000 developmental students. We found that the Ice House program had a 28% increase on student persistence, meaning, in typical community college, 50% of the students that arrive in the fall do not reappear in the spring semester. The students who took the Ice House, randomly selected to take the Ice House program, they persisted at a rate increased by 28%. We did about, I think, 15,000 students in a very large high school system across Mexico. Prepa Tech, which is the sort of the the feeder school for Tecnológico de Monterrey, one of the most entrepreneurial university systems in the world. It was very, very successfully embraced there as well. The middle school edition, I mean, I was absolutely blown away by what these 12 and 13-year-old kids were doing with Ice House. And I just got, there's a video you can watch, maybe Nick, you'll put it in the chat. I just put this cut from the video that was made by United Way. But this girl, like Madison Porter, she said, if we can think about how we can change problems into opportunities, we can make Erie a better place. That's a 12 or a 13-year-old girl demonstrating what I said earlier, the desire to solve problems, to fulfill human need through our own effort is a universal thing. Another area we could have never predicted is organizational culture. And the mayor of Albuquerque approached us several years ago and asked to teach city government workers how to think like entrepreneurs. And, you know, I was kind of like, probably most of you are, a city government worker is probably the polar opposite of an entrepreneur. So I was very reluctant to get involved with this, but he did an initial cohort with 100 people. They were so impacted by this learning that the city of Albuquerque now has put more than 3,000 city government workers. They've committed to putting all 6,000 city government workers through the Ice House program. This is led by a guy named Tom Darling, who's just done a fantastic job with this program. I interviewed him about that experience on our podcast called the Entrepreneurial Mindset Project. Nick, I'm sorry to keep springing this on you, but maybe you can find a link to that and post it in the chat as well. Okay, last one, creating entrepreneurial communities. Nonprofit organizations across the United States and around the world have embraced this program. Tom Rue, formerly of Kaufman, now the CEO of NC IDEA. They've trained more than 200 facilitators. They've made 100,000 licenses to the Ice House program available to educators, nonprofit, community development folks across North Carolina. The work they're doing there to support entrepreneurship statewide is really going to become a model for the rest of the country to emulate. So wrapping up, that's what we do. We're the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. In addition to the Ice House program, we offer professional development, keynotes, workshops, and training programs. Our next public facilitator training is July 6th through 27th. It's 4 live sessions over 4 weeks. You can click on a website. There's a lot of information there if you want to learn more about that. If you want to bring us into your organization to do an on-site facilitator training, we can also do that. Now, I know we're right up against the hour. I'm happy to stay as long as it takes to answer whatever questions we might have, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, Rhonda had a great question that I wanted to make sure folks had a chance to hear your thoughts on. Have you found it to be more difficult to affect mindset change in adults versus students?
I say generally yes. I think that's just...
that's not a yes or no. Which is harder, affecting it in students or
okay, yeah. I think the younger we are, the more malleable we are, the more neuroplasticity is there.
That being said, students are also steeped in a play the game to get an A mentality. So sometimes, depending on the application of the concepts, they can embrace them more easily. But if it's still structured within you need to do this, this, and this to get an A in the class, that's the one limiting factor there. So you have to be mindful of how you're applying the concepts too.
But another way to let's reframe the question a little bit, Rhonda, because like, how much pain are you in? Like, the only reason to be innovative and entrepreneurial is if the status quo is not working for you. Because if it is working, don't try to change it. If everything's working, keep doing that. And so, you know, I think that's why we see so many entrepreneurs coming from adverse backgrounds, because they're in pain. Whereas like the 4.0 students, they're floating along and down the academic river waiting for, 6-figure jobs the minute they set foot out of college. So there are other factors other than neuroplasticity or age to consider. Just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Eileen, for joining us. It's been great.
Yep. And I'm happy that we'll send you guys all the slides as well as the recorded session here.
And I'll put the chat in a link as well.
Yeah. I think the big takeaway for me in this research is that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. That not all of us want to start a business per se, yet we all have this innate desire to solve problems and towards growth, right? We're also growth-oriented, opportunity-seeking organisms. But at the same time, we're also stability-seeking, uncertainty-avoiding organisms. And what we're saying is that, look, don't burn down the building. Don't quit your day job. Don't disrupt the status quo. Use your discretionary thought and time and effort to experiment with new ways to make yourself more useful to more humans. That's really all this is about. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm happy to hang out if you have other questions. If not, you got to go. I understand. I'm completely honored that you spent your time with us this afternoon, and hope that we can do something to help encourage you, or something we can do to support your efforts to encourage entrepreneurial mindsets in your classrooms, in your organization, or your community. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, everybody.